This is episode number 379, if you're keeping score at home. Steve Lance is the host of the Capitol Report on NDT television, which is run by the Epoch Times. He's also the spokesman and I think a producer of the movie Unbroken, the untold story of Shen, which basically is about the performing arts, the Chinese performing arts group and how they're ridiculously persecuted by the Chinese government. And he joins us from, I never actually asked you, it's Manhattan, right?
I'm actually based in Washington, D.C., and thank you for that kind introduction.
Yeah, there's the Capitol behind you. I'm stupid.
There it is.
So you have several jobs here. You're on the Capitol Report every night. You're a vice president of NTD Television, and you're the executive producer of Sincere Pictures. And I didn't really put this together. I assume Sincere Pictures is one of the producers of this documentary, right?
Yes, they're one of the production houses that we have here in-house that does a lot of our filming and things like that.
Now, we have a lot of people from the Epoch Times on the show, and I've never been paid to shill for you guys at all, but I've always said that the Epoch Times, along with the Wall Street Journal, are the only two papers in America worth paying for. Even though if you read the Epoch Times description or entry in the Wikipedia, you'd think you guys were basically batting for the devil. It's really hilarious. I mean, I knew we need to get into this, but the first thing I think you have to understand, or you have to define for the viewers, is what is Falun Gong? That's kind of the start of this whole thing.
Absolutely. So Falun Gong, it's a ancient spiritual practice. It's based on three core tenets: truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. And it was introduced inside of communist China in 1992. And it spread like wildfire from 92 to 98 in 6 short years. According to the Chinese government's own internal census, they found that roughly 1 out of 12 Chinese people were practicing this. And, in China, that number, 1 out of 12, equates to roughly 100 million people.
Perfect. I just read today that apparently the problem was that it turned out Falun Gong had more practitioners than actually the entire membership of the Communist Party, right?
You got it. That was sort of the red flag, although it shouldn't have been, because there were actually many senior Chinese officials in the military, every prominent field in society in China had Falun Gong practitioners. And that's what sort of made it unique, was that it wasn't regional or ethnic. It was in the Han people, if you will. It could almost be equated to the national religion, and people were benefiting, health benefits, spiritual benefits, heaven forbid, no pun intended, in a communist country that there would be people gaining spiritually from something. And so that's what ultimately led the CCP, the regime leader at the time, Jiang Zemin, to condemn it and start a nationwide persecution, which ensued, and what followed was a vicious campaign of torturing, murdering, and a propaganda campaign to defame the reputations of the group.
So the Chinese Communist Party basically came to the conclusion that they were competing with this. I mean, I understand that it's officially atheistic. I understand that. But the thing is, now Falun Gong is based in Buddhism, right? And Buddhism isn't so much a religion so much as it is a spiritual practice, So you would think that they wouldn't care. I mean, am I onto something or not? Or
you are. It's a very interesting point that you bring up, which is in the West we would probably call Falun Gong a religion, but inside China, to your point, it wasn't a religion. There was no hierarchy. There was the founder who introduced it, and it spread by word of mouth, and people would just go out on their own accord in the mornings and do the 5 sets of exercises, which are kind of like Tai Chi, and there's a meditation component to it, and then they would go about their daily lives. There were no temples. There was no collecting of funds. There were, and I think that point actually is what perhaps made it even more threatening to the Chinese regime, because they didn't know who to crack down on, right? Like, it wasn't like they could go into a church and shut it down. This was all being self-driven. And, and that's also perhaps why they have not been able to root it out of China. Anybody over the past 70 years since the CCP took power that they wanted to get rid of, whether it was the landlords, the bourgeoisie, as they say, or the intellectual class, or the students in 1989, they were able to do a number on them and suppress them. But the Falun Gong, they have not been able to. They've still been able to persist. We've seen the spiritual practice grow in the West and around the world as well. So they, I would say made a bad move.
Yeah, and this entire time, even though there's still practitioners in China, they're being hauled off into prisons like by the hundreds of thousands, basically. Isn't that true?
They are, and these Falun Gong practitioners are actually victims of one of the most egregious and horrendous crimes against humanity that the world will ever see. Once it comes to the light a little bit more, and there already is hard evidence of the forced organ harvesting that has been taking place in China. It's been litigated in the China Tribunal in London back in 2018. The findings there were undeniable, that this crime is taking place. The New York Times, of all outlets, had a reporter that was getting ready to expose this. She had the goods. She spoke Chinese. She was a Westerner. She had high-ranking officials confirming it. And then her senior editors pushed her out of the newsroom. And she believes that it was because they didn't want to touch this issue because it was such a third rail for the Chinese regime.
Steve, I mean, you're a journalist. I really have to be really blunt here. What is with the New York Times? I mean, are they literally getting paid to do this? I mean, I don't understand. Now, and I have to set this up. 25 years ago, I was an ardent reader of the New York Times, and then I started to notice they were basically contradicting themselves. And then, of course, Trump got elected, and the whole thing went to hell. I mean, now I don't consider it a credible news source. But do you think are they actually getting paid to do this? I don't understand what their impetus would be to actually report this stuff erroneously. Do you?
It's an interesting discussion, right? Because when you hear the New York Times, you think of this sort of American institution of credibility, right? Everybody knows who the New York Times is. But it's also important to look at history and see the fact that they haven't always got it right. And they've actually admitted to gross, reporting that was just egregious. You look no further than Walter Duranty, the former Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times, who won the Pulitzer for his reporting there, and come to find out he was running cover for Joseph Stalin during the Ukrainian genocide.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that's just one glaring example of how the New York Times has gotten a story so wrong. But to your question, are they on the take? So much of the way the CCP operates is asymmetric, right? By proxy, breadcrumb here, breadcrumb there, but no fingerprints. And one way to look at it, I think you're onto something, which is maybe they're not, getting a paycheck directly from the Central Committee in Beijing. Maybe they are, I don't know. Some of those advertorials, as they're called, the full page ads that they at one time were taking out in the New York Times, the China Daily, you might interpret that as being on the take. An editorial that or an advertisement, a paid advertisement that looks like an editorial. I'm not sure if they're still doing that anymore, but that was one lucrative way to take in money from China. But the other thing is, if you go to the New York Times, you'll see they have different languages, and they have a very big Chinese version of the New York Times, and they also have a Beijing bureau. And so what comes along with that is access. If you have a Beijing bureau, you want to maintain it. Everybody wants access to that 1.2 billion people, or however many is left after COVID. I don't know, because we don't know the numbers. But it's really a sad state of affairs to see the paper of record in the United States, the one that you read 25 years ago, and many of our friends and family have relied upon for accurate information, to have gone down such a ominous track.
And let's briefly talk about the Epoch Times here. Now, the Epoch Times, I think, started in 2000. And it's basically started by Chinese expatriates. And I do have to do a disclaimer here, although people who watch the show know this. I'm a first-generation American, even though I'm old as the hills, and both my parents came from communist countries. So I'm not exactly a fan of communism, So I've had no trouble putting people from the Epoch Times on this program, and many of them have come on. It's a couple of them come on regularly.